potential.
If we thumb through our history books, I think there's a name down there that recurs all too much. And if we pay attention to the news online, history is on the verge of repeating itself if the current situation in Ukraine is not de-escalated.
Our agenda for the day, that is the Holocaust, was the systematic state-sponsored persecution and murder of 6 million European Jews by the Nazi German regime and its allies collaborators. The murders were carried out in mass shootings by a policy of extermination through labor in concentration camps and in gas chambers and gas vans in German extermination camps.
I now request Sanjam to introduce our speaker for the day, Ms. Cordula Simon.
A very good evening, everyone. My name is Sanjam, and it's a great honor for me to introduce our speaker for today. Ms. Cordula Simon, an Austrian writer who has expertise in German and Russian philology and gender studies. She has been working with the Youth Literature Workshop in Graz since her teenage. Ms. Simon is a member of the literary group Deep Platform, an open collective of authors based in the Graz House Literature. She was a scholarship holder of the Literary Colloquium Berlin and has received numerous awards for her works, like the Rothorn Literature Award 2012, the award for felicitous debut from the Ministry of Education and Culture, Austria, and many more. The translated titles of some of Ms. Simon's most influential works are The Potemkin Dog, Mogila Island, How to Sleep, and The New Builder. Her most recent novel, The Wolves of Pripyat, depicts a future where freedom is no more than a digital illusion. Her works have had a significant impact internationally, and this event is the testimony of the same. We are also here to testify the universality of literature and which is ironically breaking the barriers of language. Now, the topic that she's going to talk about is wordless horror, Holocaust, and propaganda. This topic, as significant as it has always been in the past, is much more important and relevant in the present world scenario. Our speaker's literal and figurative proximity with the topic would enlighten us and guide our perspective of the situation. Now back to our moderators.
Before we invite our speaker for the day, please pay attention to the following instructions so that we can go about the event smoothly. 1. Attendees are requested to use the chat box during the lecture. Number 2. There will be a question round at the end of the lecture, and attendees can ask their desirable queries once we conclude. Attendees are requested not to unmute themselves unless they have a question during the question round.
Number 4, during questions round, the speaker can use the raise hand option to be recognized. Number 5, in case of any technical difficulties, please contact the host, Megha. Number 6, while interacting, attendees are requested to be peaceful and considerate towards religious and cultural sentiments. I request our dear speaker to please begin.
Okay, so I will start now by sharing my screen. Oh, it tells me that I'm not allowed to share my screen because it isn't allowed by the host. Could you please allow screen sharing? Okay, it tells me that it's not working.
Ma'am, now you are able to do the same.
I don't know why it is not working. Okay. Do you see my? So, can you see my first sheet? Right? Can you see my first sheet? Is it okay? Do you see my screen?
Yes, we
Yes,
can
ma'am.
go to
We
that.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. And thank you again for having me here. Thank you for the English department, and thank you for your kind introduction. It sounds like it sounds like I have achieved a lot. Even in times like these, we tend to feel really small, don't we? The title of my presentation is Wordless Terror. My presentation will be about the Holocaust and the silence we are confronted with when horrible things of such dimension happen in the world. For once, because we lack vocabulary for the horrors that humans are able to inflict on one another, and secondly, because we lack the courage to be confronted or to confront someone with these nightmarish atrocities. The horror of talking about something catastrophic is a feeling we can relate to quite well in the light of recent events. Mostly, I will not speak from my point of view as a novelist, but from the scientific perspective as a member of the ARZIPS, the Austrian Center for Intelligence, Propaganda and Security Studies. My expertise lies in the field of linguistics and propaganda, but I will also speak to you as a person who is severely shaken by what we have faced in Europe within the last 12 days. For nearly 4 years, the Pearl of the Black Sea, the city of Odessa in Ukraine, was my home, and many friends of mine are doomed to stay in what becomes more hellish with every day passing. The scientific field concerning the Holocaust includes many detailed areas of research and is constantly growing with new research and findings. A great amount of scientific and other literature has been published about it in retrospective, and we try to grasp what happened and try to understand why it happened. Therefore, this talk will give a broad overview and close in on the aspect of absence of information. Because of the size of the scientific field, those aspects will have to be selected once, but further readings on the subject will be provided at the end. To be forced to select what to present to you and what to leave out bears a certain irony in itself we will address when we talk about the scientific field of propaganda. First, I will provide facts and dates about the Holocaust to give you an impression about its magnitude and relevance for the Western world and especially European countries and Israel. Then I will talk about propaganda in general, what scientific field of propaganda does and does not contain, and we will talk especially about the aspects of how the Holocaust was perceived or not perceived at the time, and put that in contrast to how the Holocaust is remembered and how this remembrance changed over the passing time. Finally, I will put your attention to artistic approaches, asking which aspects of information they use and which gaps to fill. This part also includes the question of laughter as a therapeutic tool and what people are allowed to or comfortable to laugh about. I do know that as an author, you might expect me to choose my examples in the area of literature, but most of all, we will talk about other examples that are easier to grasp for us as humans. Recommendations for anyone interested in other aspects of our talk will be given at a later point before we start our discussion, which will be open to any kind of questions in the broadest sense of our talk and also try to make connections about what we observe in the world nowadays. So, what is the Holocaust? As you heard in the introduction, the Holocaust, also known as the Shoah, was the genocide of European Jews during the Second World War. Between 1941 and 1945, Nazi Germany and its collaborators systematically murdered as much as 6 million Jews across German-occupied Europe, around 2/3 of Europe's Jewish population. Nazi Germany implemented the persecution in stages. After Adolf Hitler's appointment as Chancellor in the beginning of 1933, the regime built a network of concentration camps in Germany, primarily for political opponents and those deemed undesirable people. These concentration camps were instruments of terror and unlawful incarceration. Many Holocaust historians commonly define the Holocaust as the genocide of the European Jews by Nazi Germany and its collaborators. Recently, there were debates to widen the definition to including Romani people, disabled people, and Slavic people, who also were persecuted in the great machinery of death of Nazi Germany. The term Holocaust comes from the Greek holocaustos, meaning whole and a burnt offering. The biblical term Shoah comes from the Hebrew word Shoah and means destruction. The roots that could be found for the anti-Semitism in Europe already started in the Middle Ages. Jews were subjected to anti-Semitism based on Christian theology, which blamed them for killing Jesus. They were often persecuted and isolated in Jewish ghettos. They were blamed for anything that goes wrong. When there was a pandemic, they were blamed for putting poison into the water. After the First World War, Hitler's worldview of the Jews as something evil became quite common in Germany, because after the First World War from 1914 to 1918, many Germans could not accept that their country had been defeated. And there was a myth going around, a stab in the back myth, insinuating that disloyal politicians, chiefly Jews and communists, would have orchestrated Germany's murder. Throughout the 1930s, the legal, economic, and social rights of Jews were steadily restricted. On the 1st of April 1933, there was a boycott of Jewish businesses. Jews were disbarred from practicing law, being editors or proprietors of newspapers, joining the Journalists Association, or owning farms. Jewish businesses were targeted for closure or Aryanization, as Hitler called it, the forcible sale of the properties to German. This picture shows a man holding this sign written, Germans rise up, don't buy anything from the Jews. The economic strain of the Great Depression led Protestant charities and some members of the German medical establishment to advocate compulsory sterilization for incurable mentally and physically disabled people. The Nazis called lebensunwertes Leben, the life unworthy life. In October 1939, Hitler signed a euthanasia decree to carry out a program of involuntary euthanasia.
1 second, I'm so sorry to interrupt Cordula, but I guess the slides are not moving.
Excuse me?
Slides are not moving. Slides of the PPT.
Oh no, they are not moving.
No.
How can this be? Not at all.
No, we can just see the title slide, but not rest.
So that is bad.
I think it would be good if you do them manually as well. Now
Do you see?
Yes. Now
Do you see this now? Do you see?
Yes.
Then we're gonna go this way. Is it? If it is okay for you.
Yeah, it's fine.
So this is the picture I showed last.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Right.
And this one is about where I was talking about the economic strain, because people were convinced that Jews and disabled and mentally disabled people are a great burden for society. This is what they believed. Then the Nuremberg laws were implicated. On the 15th September of 1935, the Reichstag passed the Reichscitizenship Law and the Law for the Protection of German Blood and German Honor, infamously known as the Nuremberg Laws. This stated that only those of German or kindred blood could be citizens. Anyone with 3 or more Jewish grandparents were classified as Jews. Furthermore, marriages between Jews and subjects of the state of German or related blood are forbidden. Sexual relationships between them were also criminalized. In this criminalization, we see these two people, one holding the shield that she is only doing things with Jewish boys, and from the man there that he is only sleeping with German girls. By the end of 1934, 50,000 German Jews had left Germany, and by the end of 1938, approximately half the German Jewish population emigrated to various neighboring countries or even farther away. At the 12th of March in 1938, Germany annexed Austria, the country where I'm actually living, my home. The special units of the SS, the Schutzstaffel, and the SA, the Sturmabteilung, smashed shops and stole cars belonging to Jews. Austrian police stood by, some already wearing swastika armbands. Austrian sympathizers for Hitler helped the German forces. In what is called the Reichskristallnacht, in a rather euphemistic way, the night of broken glass, the pogroms from the 9th to the 10th November in 1938, over 7,500 Jewish shops out of 9,000 were looted and attacked, and over 1,000 synagogues were damaged and destroyed. You see on the picture a burning synagogue. Those were really big pogroms, but I do believe in the aftermath that they probably were not as big as Hitler had hoped for. Large numbers of Jews were sent to concentration camps following the Kristallnacht in November 1938. After war broke out in 1939, new camps were established, many outside Germany in occupied Europe. Forced labor of camp prisoners became commonplace. Vernichtung durch Arbeit, extermination through labor, it was called. Transportation to and between the camps was often carried out in closed freight cars with little rations and water, long delays, and prisoners packed tightly. The euphemistic term Umsiedelung, resettlement, was used for the transportation of Jews to these camps, suggesting they would really just resettle elsewhere. Pogroms occurred throughout the occupation of most countries. During these, in Lviv, a former Polish town now being part of Ukraine, in June and July. Excuse me? Everything all right?
I think somebody has their audio on. All the participants
accident.
are very humbly requested that please put off your mics. We are putting this time and again in the chat box also, but still people are not doing it. Kindly do this, or else we'll have to remove you from the meeting and you won't be able to join again. So once again, I insist that please put off your mics.
In this Polish town, now a part of Ukraine, in June and July 1941, roughly 6,000 Jews were murdered in the streets by Ukrainian nationalists who supported and aided Nazi Germany, also because of their shared anti-Semitism. With the German invasions of France, Norway, Denmark, Danish, Norwegian, and French Jews were deported. The same happened after the invasion of Yugoslavia and Greece in 1941. Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941. German propaganda portrayed the conflict as an ideological war between German National Socialism and Jewish Bolshevism, and as a racial war between the Germans and the Jewish, Romani, and Slavic Untermenschen, subhumans, as they called them. Mass shootings from the so-called Einsatztruppen, the special task forces, followed, this time under the command of Reinhard Heinrich of the SS. At the end of 1941, the Germans began constructing the infamous extermination camps in sparely inhabited areas in Poland: Belzec, Chelmo, Majdanek, Sobibor, and Treblinka, and of course Auschwitz, they were called. Those are the camps. Anyone with 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents was to be exterminated, and complex rules, this is from the Nuremberg laws, devised to deal with mixed breeds, Mischlinge. Bureaucrats identified who was a Jew, confiscated property, and scheduled trains to deport them. The logistics of the mass murder turned Germany into a genocidal state, the first time a state had thrown its full power behind the idea that an entire people should be physically exterminated without leaving any traces behind. This genocidal state was decided at the Wannsee Conference at this place in Wannsee in Berlin in January 1942. SS Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich, head of the Reich Security Head Office, convened the conference. The Gestapo, the German secret state police, and other SS party leaders were present. A single document found in 1947, the Wannsee Protocol, was found in a German Foreign Office folder written by SS leader Adolf Eichmann, a document in euphemistic language presenting the final solution to the Jewish question, die Endlösung der Judenfrage. Following the conference, gas chambers had been installed in the concentration camps by the spring and summer of 1942. The Jewish death toll in the extermination camps alone was over 3 million overall. Most Jews were gassed on arrival when selection processes on who can work and who can't work were forced upon them. Those selected to death at all camps were told to undress and hand their valuables to camp workers. They were then herded naked into gas chambers. To prevent panic, they were told that the gas chambers were showers or delousing chambers. The poison used was Cyclone B. Most of the victims at these camps were buried in pits at first. From the mid-1942s, a part of the Sonderaktion 1005, prisoners at Auschwitz, Kielmer, Belzig, Sobibor, and Treblinka were forced to exhume and burn bodies that had been buried before, in part to hide any evidence of the atrocities, and in part because of the terrible smell pervading the camps and fear that the drinking water would become polluted. In 1943, it became more and more evident that the German political as well as military, that Nazi Germany was losing the war. Nevertheless, rail shipments of Jews were still arriving regularly from Western and Southern Europe at the extermination camps. Shipments of Jews had priority on German railways over anything but the army's needs, and continued even in the face of the increasingly dire military situation at the end of 1942. The mass murder reached a frenetic pace in 1944, when at Auschwitz alone, nearly 500,000 people were gassed. In the final stage of the war, from January to April 1945, the SS sent inmates westward on death marches to camps in Germany and Austria, so they could not be freed by the advancing Soviet forces. In January 1945, the Germans held records of 740,000 inmates in concentration camps. By May, 250,000, 30% of this number, had died during these marches. The liberation came in the last week of war from the Soviet and American army. The Jews killed represented around 1/3 of the world's Jewry and about 2/3 of European Jews, based on a pre-war figure of 9.7 million Jews in Europe. The most commonly cited death toll is the 6 million given by Adolf Eichmann to SS members. Historians estimate range from over 4 million to 7 million. Almost all Jews in German-occupied Poland and Baltic states and the USSR were murdered, with a 5% chance of survival on average. Of Poland's 3.3 million Jews, about 90% were murdered. So, the question we of course ask ourselves today is, how could that happen, and why exactly did people look away? And this is where we step into the field of propaganda. What is propaganda? Anyway, in day-to-day life, the term propaganda is associated with brainwashing, manipulating, and guiding opinions and especially in German-speaking countries with old Nazi speeches and Nazi media. One suspects bad intentions, the distortion of truth, hot air, or simply lies. From a scientific perspective, this is far from the multiple shapes of propaganda. The term came to be connotated in a negative way after the First World War and even more in the second half of the 20th century. Primarily, this happened because of the ever-present association with the extensive and highly successful media manipulation of National Socialism and its crimes. Up to this time, the term was used quite innocently. In the centuries before, it was used for the professional missionaries of the Catholic Church starting in the 17th century, of the Counter-Revolution, the messages of the French Revolution, Karl Marx and anarchists alike. Historically, it is so much more than lies and manipulation. It is means to the ends, a tool to transport ideas of any kind. Far from all polemic, neutral and in a broad scientific science, it is a fascinating phenomenon that became part of our communication in religion, politics, society, and economics, states, parties, companies, NGOs, religions. Everyone makes propaganda to disseminate their ideas. Dissemination of ideas is its goal, as the origin of the term tells us. In Latin, propagare means to disseminate. Even though many people avoid the word, talk about public relations, marketing, persuasion, and more. From this, we can conclude that in the scientific sense, propaganda is no evil in its own. Propaganda changes and assimilates permanently to our also ever-changing social and media world to be effective. Well, in hindsight, propaganda throughout history sometimes seems ridiculous, plump, and easily recognizable. We still like to fall for narratives when they come with or in the form of popular widespread memes into our own bubble of feelings, thoughts, convictions, and ideas. Let's define the term. Propaganda is a form of communication that hopes to evoke a reaction from the recipient that was intended by the propagandist. While in modern media, the term is often not more than an accusation in the analysis of texts and campaigns, whether propagandist methods were used, which are more or less something like finger pointing on those who are pointing fingers. It is also far more than the study of Nazi or Soviet or American propaganda in the field of history. In the sciences of propaganda, we find science of cognition, science of communication, marketing studies, and any field busy studying technological changes since radio, TV, and in today's World Wide Web. This is due to the fact that the question, what moves the masses, what makes people react in a certain way, are at the core of many disciplines, while being at the same time the holy grail for proponents of political worldviews. All of those disciplines have their unique approach and are connected when talking about concepts and theories of propaganda. For the members of the philosophical Frankfurter Schule in the midst of the last century, science of communication, marketing, and propaganda were inseparable because they're related by their methods. The only way to separately consider them is their goal. Advertising uses the same methods as propaganda, but the goal is selling something and to be commercially successful with it, even though companies already use worldview to market their products, like for example Pepsi or Coca-Cola in its LGBTQ-themed advertisements, which makes the borders between the two blur. Also, public relations do not necessarily include the spread of ideological messages. We also find them with companies, NGOs, in sports and music. Propaganda is symbolical communication, and propaganda doesn't objectively change reality, but changes the subject, the subjective construct of what reality is, that can, but doesn't necessarily have to, lead to a changing reality in turn. Propaganda isn't material, but symbolical and medially translated. It works with language and pictures that are manipulated to connect within the reception process positive or negative attitudes. And one of the most used methods of propaganda is selection. It is the distribution of carefully selected information, and it tends to be overlooked that the key to propaganda often isn't what is said, but what is left out. You can see how concerning missing information shows us again how neutral and unemotional the term propaganda should be treated within analysis. Because, as I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, we have to break our subjects down into pieces, as people working for news agencies also have to. One always has to choose, because no story can ever be told in the exact length it happened, providing every single detail. One has to decide what to say, on what to focus, and we don't have the choice to not leave something out, so we choose what we want others to hear. Propaganda makes use of the fact that humankind perceives most information secondhand by media or influential entities. They have the possibility to change the representation of the world by media for the recipient. It is a specific type of communication that assumes that the public opinion influences political decisions and that the media are the most powerful organizers of public discourse. Therefore, even in Western democracies, propaganda inhabits a place in society, because if the opinion of the masses is irrelevant, one needn't bother so much as to convince us all. So, and now let's go back to the propaganda of the Holocaust. Having all this said, let's take a look at propaganda and the Holocaust. What did people actually know at the time all of this happened about what was going on in their surroundings? In the Third Reich, the so-called Judenfrage, the question of the Jews and how they should be eliminated, existed, but in public there was no official plan known about when and how this should happen. Rhetorical, there were used ambiguous terms, euphemistic, like the mass shootings were called evacuation by members of the party in the end. So if people in Germany, in German-speaking countries chose to, they could act as if nothing is happening, even though depredations from train stations were public, where people were rounded up, but in Germany people talked about relocation into work camps. The fact that these people will be killed was knowingly left out by the Nazis and their leaders. Talking about it could end in a death sentence. The isolation, disenfranchisement, and impoverishment of Jews, as much as their disappearance was obvious by them being missing in public life, as much as the information being missing of what happened to them. Most Germans were too afraid to speak out or say anything against the regime, even though over time more and more rumors, information, and details leaked into public, from soldiers on their home leave, from railroad workers, from enemies' radio stations, or through whisper propaganda. Some believed that 90% of the people of Germany at the time didn't know or didn't want to know that 100,000 of Jews had already been killed in the early stages of the atrocities. And this picture shows citizens of Germany who are forced to look at the victims of the camp in Auschwitz after Auschwitz had been freed, or what was left of those people. So, but what did we know over the border in the Allied countries? In the Allied countries, the inner politics of the National Socialist state and the persecution of Jews and other minorities was criticized already early on. After the war started, those criticisms started to get louder, but it were only words of concern, and no one tried to successfully evacuate the Jews in the countries that had been assaulted by the Third Reich. After 1938, these countries also didn't want to take even more refugees than the years before. Also within the war, primary goal was the utter military capitulation of the Third Reich. Freeing the death camps was secondary. The first reports were even tried to be hushed down by the US Foreign Ministry. The British government also chose not to help and declined to take more refugees because of safety reasons. Even to pay for the freedom of 70,000 Jews was declined by British government as not to weaken their own war efforts. The Soviet Union did surrender many Jews, and quite a lot of them communists who fled to the Soviet Union after the Hitler-Stalin Pact. After the assault on the Soviet Union by the Third Reich, the fate of the Soviet Jews was ignored by German and Soviet media alike. The mass murder of Jews was ignored by Soviet media as well. The reception after the war changed. Anti-Semites and historical revisionists began immediately after the war to claim that the Holocaust never happened, or to relativize, sometimes in the most extreme ideological corners, even stating that it was necessary or right, or even glorify it. In post-1945, right-wing or national socialistic groups, then the denial of Holocaust is still a frequent tendency. But even in newer, more modern right-wing groups, Islamistic groups, and anti-Zionistic groups, it is common. In Austria and Germany, because of our history as perpetrators of this crime against humanity, the public denial of the Holocaust in any form is therefore considered incitement and is prosecuted by law with harsh sentences. Worldwide, every year Memorial Days, like for example on the 27th of January, the day of the freeing of Auschwitz, are held. Museums and memorials in cities and landscapes commemorate the abomination of the state that went to exterminate. In Jerusalem, the most important of these is Yad Vashem. In Germany and the former occupied countries, memorials are located at the concentration and death camps of the Third Reich. There are documentation centers in Vienna, Washington, D.C., and Budapest, and when you walk through European cities, sometimes you find a so-called stumbling block in front of you, a gold-colored stone in the pavement that looks different, with names and dates on it of people who used to live at this address and were deported and killed by the Nazi regime. This and much more is done to remember and talk about the horror no one could talk about at the time. And especially in new media, we find examples of this narrative, what has happened going on with an Instagram account, for example, of Anne Frank, the 13-year-old Jewish girl that wrote a diary and was gassed in Bergen-Belsen. And as you see, there's this Instagram account, and I will give you the link after this talk. As divided as the perception of the Holocaust became in the years following the war, as heated became the discussions about guilt. My country, Austria, the little area southeast of Germany, claimed for many decades to be the first victim of the Third Reich, that the annexation of Austria was an invasion, while the historical documents and pictures of the Third Reich tell us otherwise, that many people cheered when Austria was annexed. Even though we know that there must have been people who cried that day, but German propaganda wouldn't film those in despair. It is one of the many examples showing that the world is not simple and how the narrative of propaganda of the Third Reich was powerful even after its downfall, and how it left people with conflicting self-images, but not only in Austria, but also in other countries where not only victims, but also Nazi collaborators were found. One might claim that there have been many genocides in our world using different methods, killing more people or just killing them in different and more or less brutal ways. But it is a single example of a state deciding to wipe a whole people from the face of the earth and to do so in a highly efficient, industrially organized way in so many occupied countries, all touched by pain and guilt alike. The clinical pure way of the state going hand in hand with the primitiveness and dirt of war and the brutality of those who had to put this way into realization. This is quite a Eurocentric point of view, even Western Eurocentric, you might argue. As people are always closest to themselves, so are we, and therefore humans tend to compare genocides. For people in Rwanda in Africa, it is the massacre of the Tutsi and those who wouldn't participate in 1994. For the Ukrainians, the so-called Holodomor, the big hunger in the 30s, inflicted by the Soviet Union, occupies this place. Or it could be the Bengal famine of 1943, where people shared similar fates. Other eyes are attentive. What will happen to the Uyghurs in China? Global remembrance diverges from our Eurocentric approach, and for Western European people, it is often not understandable that in other countries the Holocaust is sometimes not considered as big as a deal as in Germany, and its people still suffer from the burden of guilt and historical responsibility, trying never to forget the horrors of their past. What could not be said while it happened has to be repeated again and again, as omnipresent warning. Do not look away again, not let something like this happen again, not be silent on subjects selected for propagandists and be left out. The repetition of some of these elements of this wordless disaster of humanity are now threatening our times. Russia has no independent media anymore. The war in Ukraine doesn't exist. There only exists some kind of special operations, and this time it's not called a relocation. Most social media platforms are forbidden in Russia, and only a few thousand people of 146 million Russians knowing what is happening through VPN or through friends and relatives in Ukraine protest this regime in Russia. Talking about the war is not bringing the death sentences in the Third Reich, but up to 15 years in Russian jail might sound horrible enough for people to speak up. The efforts to prevent fake news on both sides, which means also in Western countries, but not as much so as in Russia, lead to information of isolation and a new border of lacking information on both sides, a problem that was foreseeable in the behavior of Russians and Ukrainians alike in the beginning of the war in the year 2014, labeled as a civil war. The Russian propaganda claimed that everyone protesting the pro-Russian regime is a Nazi, which now led to what is called by Putin Denazification. In Ukrainian media, Russian separatists were called terrorists. When the Soviet Union went into war against the Nazis, denazification and anti-fascism were their propagandistic motive to rally people of Mother Russia to fight against the invaders, and they still evoke a sentiment of heroism in the Great War of the Fatherland, which shows the deep and still living roots of this narrative and memory of this long past war. It provides even nowadays a self-image to rally people under its banner, fighting the Nazis and fighting for the right thing. In our human disposition, following the analysis of data by American psychologist Jonathan Haidt, people tend to click on the thing they always knew and on the thing they deem 100% wrong. Clickbait and rage bait push people like a centrifuge to the borders of the political spectrum. We have seen this dichotomies concerning the refugee crisis in Europe, and we have seen them with COVID-19 vaccination advocates and its opponents. This is because the algorithms that guide all our social media experience push these articles directly to the top of our timelines. Popular internet memes seem to play a bigger role nowadays than speeches, and again, something is always missing. Something is always selected away. And now we are open to discuss what is happening and what we might learn from our history and how does this modern war propaganda use the internet. I'd be happy to hear about your thoughts and approaches on the matter. As you can see, here's one Russian propaganda meme and one Ukrainian one, and there's a screenshot of Contacted, a Russian Facebook being blocked. I can't open my page anymore. So what have we learned so far? What was I talking about? The horrors of the Holocaust were not named at the time. Propaganda does not only contain narratives, but pre-selected absences. The lack of words leads to different perceptions, even after proven facts. History doesn't repeat itself, but human behavior does, and it leads to patterns of understanding. And what can we learn about our own narratives in the light of this history? Thank you for listening to me, and I'd be happy to hear your voices on the subject.
Ma'am, that was thoroughly riveting. Now we proceed with our event and begin the questions round. Please use the raise hand option so that we can recognize the speakers. I repeat, anybody who has a question can use the raise hand option that is available on the screen so that I can recognize you and make a list of speakers.
You can also raise your hand if you have answers.
Yes, there is Aman Kaur.
Hi, so this is Aman. Can I ask the question here? Do I need to type it in the chat box?
I can hear you fine, so you
Okay.
can just ask.
So thanks for this interesting talk. So I had like two questions in my mind. One is that when we talk about, this power of propaganda. I mean, sometimes some of the scholars they sort of caution that there are limits to the power of propaganda, and they think that it succeeds not because it persuades the public to believe an entirely new set of ideas, but because it expresses beliefs people already hold. So, do you agree with that? Would people have rejected Nazi propaganda if they didn't already share to some extent the beliefs that it communicated? That's my first question. And second is like I was thinking about propaganda in relation to collective memory. Like, so what we think about, propaganda or Holocaust, and its relation to the memory. So, in how this remembered past shapes and constraints are present, or vice versa. And how does the role of propaganda then determine our understanding of history or collective memory of the Holocaust? Particularly in context of Holocaust, but then when we are thinking about Ukraine or the other countries, which are sort of like moving towards the dictatorships and all that. So they also. So how do you see the role of memory in that as well? Thanks.
Okay, I will start with your first question. I do think you are absolutely right, because propagandists always say methodically, it is good if things do not come on their own. It's like George Lakoff, the linguist, says something like frames come in packages, and they come in packages of worldviews. And people think, okay, if this belongs to my worldview anyway, then I'm going to believe the fact that is presented. And so they really just sometimes only move a little bit from their former worldview by perceiving that everyone else holding their worldview believes a certain fact. And I do think that is a really important point, because we don't just turn around by 180 degrees. It has to be prepared. And Nazi Germany did a lot of efforts to prepare. A problem was that in Germany, the people were actually not that, not in the same way anti-Semitic for the most part, like the Nazi leaders were, because the Nazi leaders and most of all Adolf Hitler really wanted them to be dead and to not exist anymore. Most Germans at the time probably didn't like the Jews, and they would wish that they would be less successful, because the emancipation of the Jews just had started. And there were a lot of different things the Jews were not allowed to do, jobs they could not take. So a lot of Jews became bankers and doctors, and the Jewish doctor was always welcome, but they were never close enough so that the German people really bothered to stand up for them. And the second thing, I do believe that these narratives and how they change over time really do give us a self-image. So for the Ukrainians, there's this conflicting self-image like we have in Austria. They had collaborators, they had Nazis, they had Banderisti. They are now like around 3% of the publication of the residents. Citizens, that's the word I'm looking for. Excuse my English. So about 3% of citizens are really like Banderisti, Nazi, people who like to kill Jews and who are national socialists in Ukraine. But that's only 3%. And still in Russia, the perception is everyone who went to the Maidan, anyone who doesn't want a pro-Russian regime has to be a Nazi. And there in Russia, that is a different narrative and a different self-image, because they didn't have as many collaborators. Their goal was to smash the German army, to fight the Nazis, who did such atrocities, even if no one seemed to bother who they did the atrocities to. And so that's their narrative of we are heroes because we are fighting the Nazis.
Thank you.
Was this an answer?
My questions. Yeah, thanks. Thanks.
A little announcement before further questions. I would really like anybody who's asking a question to turn on their camera so that it can be more obvious. You can again use the raise hand option. I'll be making a list again.
You also can tell me your thoughts about the ongoing events.
Okay, so I personally had a question in my mind. I was thinking that even now, decades after the atrocities, do you think that it affects the mindset of the people whose ancestors were considered to be the perpetrators of crime in the form of a collective unconscious guilt, perhaps, that their ancestors were responsible for all of that?
In fact, it does. There are people who do feel really guilty. Some feel really guilty for not even asking their grandparents what they did and what they thought at the time. A lot of elderly people do not want to talk about this anymore, but the young people are curious about how this could happen. And older people really often just don't like these kind of questions. And some really seem to take the guilt of their forebears onto themselves and suffer from it and try to find any kind of hateful tendencies between groups that they might find. Some get lost in these, some even suddenly start to consider people fascists who are really far from fascism. And sometimes fascists get left out from this kind of blame, even though they are. And it seems to be really difficult. And I do think that there's some kind of historical luggage in any society, considering things that are not really talked about. There are also actually sometimes people try to cope with this by distancing themselves. And one way of distancing is making jokes. And jokes about the Holocaust, I mean, you can imagine most people don't think that it's funny, but I do believe there's the telling of the joke as a therapy. There's this joke in Austria where one said, yeah, my grandfather died in the concentration camps, and everyone pities him, and he says, yeah, he was falling off the tower because he was drunk during his shift. Things like this, to put distance between themselves and others. We can see jokes like this also in Russian and Ukrainian language. In Odessa, there was this joke told for the last few years where one Odessite tells another one, I'm not gonna speak Russian anymore. And the other one asks him, are you afraid that the Ukrainians are gonna kill you? He says, no, but I'm afraid that the Russians come to my rescue. Which is objectively a joke. I once did a seminar on comic theory. Comic theory isn't funny, but from the structure, they are jokes. And I do think that people use them to free themselves from these thoughts, from their guilt, from their being afraid. And that's why people joke about it. They are also a place of propaganda.
So it's a form of a coping mechanism, basically, for people. Okay, so we have another question coming up from Miss Vasudha. If you could please turn on your cam as well.
Okay, thank you. My query is with reference to the propaganda as we were talking of. Now, when we say that there is a propaganda and we look at the current Ukraine and Russia situation, compared to what happened at the time of Holocaust, at this moment there is more access to social media. There are various ways you can give informations. Do you think that some lessons were taken up, were learned from the way Holocaust propaganda was done, and that was used by Russia now to paint Ukraine in a bad light? And was it possible for Ukraine and now for other European countries to do a counter propaganda and ensure that the current generations are who are being forced into a war are able to come out of it unscathed?
Well, I do think that the Russian propaganda does have something in common with the Nazi propaganda, especially about what it doesn't want to tell its people. Russian government doesn't seem to want the people to know what is happening, so they can't judge freely about it, and that is a really old method. But one has to say that it is not sure that someone just took up a book by Joseph Goebbels from the Nazi party and looked how he did that, because people are getting the idea how to propagate something over and over again because it is so close to marketing, which means that people like marketing specialists and persuasion techniques from all over the world, every time someone wants to propose some political idea and propagate a political idea, people tend to take just the newest information they get from this field. They are always up to time. They are always on top of whatever the marketing game is right now. And the marketing game right now seems to be, especially for Ukraine, memes. In Western countries, it looks like the information war will be won by Ukraine. We do have a lot of memes, a lot of kind memes, funny memes. People are making jokes about in meme form that you can see things from outer space like the Grand Canyon and Volodymyr Zelensky's balls. That is what they do to bring their message. But for the people in Russia, it is still hard to get to information because of Facebook shutting down. They are not allowed to use it anymore. They can't use YouTube. They do have to use a virtual private network to get into one of those. They are persecuted if they do. It is quite difficult, and I think we are far away from the hope of anyone being unscarred. I do believe that it is really hard now for people, and this escalation is a catastrophe, and people are already bleeding, and we can see getting bigger.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for the response, ma'am.
I thank you.
All right, next we have on the list Miss Gasha.
Hi, first of all, thank you for this talk. It was really interesting, and I loved how, like, even the easiest concept or even the toughest concept, they were like explained so easily for anyone who has not been researching propaganda. So I have a couple questions. My first one is that how has propaganda evolved from the Nazi times to now, like in 2022, especially when we talk about how fake news was a huge thing in, say, the American elections, and how Facebook is under fire because of algorithm manipulation. And like, how do these tactics, how have they evolved, how have these tools intensified? And my other question is, like, how do the tactics or tools, how do they get developed to counter these new emerging methods of propaganda, like fake news and bots and all social media manipulation?
The really new field of fake news is quite interesting, and there are different types of fake news. There's the classical fake news. Someone made something up, whatever it is, and people believe it because the world is unbelievable. And if people in Western countries hear that, oh, there's this town in China and the smoke is so thick that they watch their sunrises on screens, then people in Western Europe might believe it because, well, the world itself does provide some really impossible things. So why shouldn't it be possible? But those are more or less harmless. What is even more problem are misinformation and disinformation. Misinformation is really often what just happens by, for example, selecting what is to be presented, especially in newspaper articles that have to be short because people don't want to read so much and their attention spans are getting shorter and shorter. And they have to pre-select, and sometimes newspapers nowadays, because people paying print newspapers, they are on the decline, which means that the only way to really get money for newspapers is to do advertisement, and then it's a decision of clicks. And as we tend not to click on really elaborated, long and differentiated articles, but on the short summary, really often something gets left out. And then furthermore, media often doesn't have the resources and the money to check up on every information. So they get the information sometimes from someone working for CNN. Most newspapers don't have any correspondence anymore in other countries. They just use whatever the press agency from someone who has someone there gives them. And then they don't ask, is this information true? They ask, is the source reliable? And even a reliable source can sometimes come along with facts that are not really or not entirely true. That's just mistakes happening, which is catastrophic for the perception of media, because every time one of these mistakes, who are mostly honest mistakes, happen, media gets aggressive results from people reading it. This is a problem, and also their lack of resources. And on the fighting, and then there's of course still not only misinformation, but also disinformation. And disinformation is something really, really exciting for people with security and intelligence agencies, because it is purposely planted wrong information to achieve a political goal. And there's a term for these in intelligence agencies that is called active measures, which means you propose something as a fact, and by proposing it as a fact at the right place, you might make it happen, or you might make a reaction that you want to see happen. And that really leads to problems and aggressions between countries. That is a real problem. Considering the fighting of fake news, this is really a difficult topic. If you look at the European Union side on what to do against fake news, then the solution is, let's make a campaign. And I mean, campaigning, yeah, well, tell people not to believe fake news anymore, and they won't, of course. I'm sure this will work. It never does, but they don't really have any kind of solution for it. From the AZIPs, we put together a workshop for school children that if they see a newspaper article, they know, I'm going to check on the picture. I'm going to check if the weather on Google was the same at that tape and the picture was taken. I'm going to check on the person posting it. I'm going to check with TinEye or with Google Lens what is what. I'm going to find out little details so I can decide, is it true or not. The bad news is it's a lot of work, but I do think that teenagers with their smartphones, they can really, from inside the family, really say, hey, I just checked up on this. Mom, please don't believe that. That is a good way to work, but this one is exhausting. And recently, we also went through all this sociological books about how to teach media literacy in schools. And most of these books, I mean, I do understand why a lot of people teaching are annoyed, are only theory. So they are not really as helpful, but we stumbled upon a study with, I think, around 40,000 proponents. And there is exactly one way that makes people less gullible and less belief in fake news. And this sounds counterintuitive, but it is writing fake news. If you open your computer and just put into Google, write your own fake news, then it will present your site and you can put your own fake news together. And this does make people really skeptical. They see how easy it is to do something like that. They can try to troll their own friends on Facebook, and the next time they see any kind of newspaper article, the first reaction will be, but is it true? And so that's what plants a deep, deep skepticism. And even though it sounds like a paradox, that seems to work quite fine. So I tell everyone all the time, please write fake news, which is crazy. But if it helps these people to decide whether something is true or not, I think it's a way.
Okay, thank you. That was a really detailed answer and quite interesting. Thank you.
The next question we have here is from Anmol.
Ma'am, considering your genre of writing, that is horror, and if you look at the, like you told us about the condition that was in Germany, and if we parallelize it with what is happening in Ukraine, do you think the horror genre is just a projection of the dark side of human nature?
I am not sure, because when writing an artistic text, I try not to think too much about what that reflects or does. I try to take little influences and words and try to make it interesting. And then by accident, it gets a dystopian novel. I'm sure that it reflects what I have learned in the years. In my last novel, I called TV signal, what's it called? Outlet. I call it the honest ether, because in Russia the first program is called Priyama Efir. Priyama, it doesn't only mean the first, it also means the honest one, the standing right up one, and things like that. And of course I've used things like this. What is always a shock for me is when time goes by and I know what I thought was extraordinary, and I made up in my mind something like this just happens somewhere. Nothing of the things that happen now in Ukraine do happen in my novel, actually, but it's called The Wolves of Pripyat. And like a week ago, there was this news that Vladimir Putin occupied the town of Pripyat. I'm not sure how you familiar you are with Pripyat. Pripyat is the town where Chernobyl was standing with the atomic reactor that exploded in 1986. So everything there is radioactive. The nature really, I mean, we wouldn't believe this, but it's actually kind of a paradise, because people had to leave it because it's radioactive. And there's animals, there's wolves, there's bears, there's animals that have been extinct in Europe. And there's a lot of plants and flowers, and they hold and they just take back everything that is asphalt and human made. And when I heard that, I thought, maybe Putin really went crazy now, because knowing what I know about this place, there is nothing, there's no infrastructure, there's nothing worth taking for military. There's this wilderness and mud and woods. Why would he do that? And then I found these videos online from the Ukrainian army, and they are asking those that they took captive. They ask them, what's your name? Where do you come from? What do you work? What's the number of your battlement? And they answer really fast, except for one who's been in the reservist, and who has only been there for 2 weeks. And they can answer that really fast. But then they start to ask, what are you doing here? I don't know. You know where you are? And some of them answer, I understood that I'm in Ukraine because they only got the information where they are geographically by getting captured. They are asked, why didn't you shoot? And they say, because the others didn't shoot at us, because the Ukrainian army doesn't open fire. And those Russian soldiers, who are all really, really young, between 19 and 22 years old, didn't open fire either when they realized where they were. They are asked, when did you cross the border? They don't have an answer. They were shipped to Belarus for the purpose of some Übung, for an exercise. Their mobile phones were taken from them. They were told you don't need it with the exercise. And then they drove over through Chernobyl, where there's no border marked. You can't see where you passed the border, which means that Vladimir Putin had to drive his soldiers over this border so that they don't know where they are. He had to deceive his own soldiers because they wouldn't fight against their brothers. And then I knew why he chose Pripyat. He had to choose it because there is nothing. There's only nature and yeah.
All right, ma'am. Thank you. That answers my question. Any further questions? We'll be entertaining one more question.
I think Dr. Sukhdev wants to ask a question.
Well, I would definitely like to say a few words on this interesting talk by Cordula. Well, see, first of all, I would say that propaganda is not fake news. Propaganda actually is hiding and highlighting. It's a kind of relationship between hiding and highlighting. You hide some facts and highlight others. And then you highlight the first and then hide the second. You know, this kind of scheme is what we can say is propaganda. Second, if you look at the history, we see that after the Second World War, there is shift from political power to economic power. Now, after the Second World War, America has become the leader of the economic power. Before Second World War, England was the leader of the political power. So power somehow remains in the West. So it remains in Europe. There is nobody who is raising any issue and bringing any issues about Asia. Asia is completely in the dark. See, then there is expansion of the English language, which creates another inequality in communication. You know, propaganda is inherent in communication. Russia and several other countries cannot compete in propaganda because they do not have access to the English language. As the whole West has it, both England and America, they have access to the English language, that's their mother tongue. See, after the Second World War, when there is rise of the economic power, there is rise of the corporates as well. In the past, there were newspapers and channels which reported from the field, and to an extent, there was factual communication. But recently, what we observe is the medium of communication of all kind, you know, all media, whether electronic or print media, that is controlled by the corporates. So most TV channels now in relation to Ukrainian war are comparing Putin with Nazi Hitler. They are also comparing the goals of this war with the goals of the German Nazi war. This is what we see in the form of highlighting and hiding the fact that it is actually the war of the oil. America wants to sell its own oil now, and in the past it wanted to sell as a kind of mediator the oil of the oil of the Middle East countries, and now they don't want that Russian oil should be sold in the world market. And the pipelines of Russia were put down during the Soviet period through Ukraine. So the economy of Russia depends upon actually on Ukraine. Another point is about NATO, which nobody is raising. Since the what we call dissolution of the two worlds, well, Warsaw Pact was dissolved, but NATO was not dissolved. NATO is actually a military alliance. It is alliance of the
I think it
militaries,
was
and
because
now
of
the number of
the Warsaw Pact.
yeah.
It should be the counterweight to the Warsaw Pact, right? I don't see the Warsaw Pact, so yeah, you're right.
Yeah. So now the number of members of NATO is increased to 30. Why? Why? I mean, for what they are making an alliance? For what they are making a military alliance when there is no opponent? And Ukraine wants to join that group. Why? Why does it want to join that? So Putin actually has its existential problems. If Ukraine joins NATO, the army of US can reach the borders of Russia and can very easily take over the belt, where they produce actually the wheat. And
yeah, I'm not sure about Ukraine definitely wanting to be with NATO, but they did feel threatened by Russia because Russia controlled them with oil and gas.
Russia actually, the threats are now, but since 91, Russia has been speaking to Ukraine not to go to NATO, but
yeah,
with the coming of
but there are a lot of other countries who also shouldn't have been to NATO.
No, see, why should they be NATO? Why should they be
Yeah.
a military alliance of several countries?
Yeah.
US as a self-styled leader introduced military intervention in Iraq, in Afghanistan. Did it consult any Asian countries when it came to Afghanistan? And it was a propaganda. It was justified by a propaganda that it was the forces were peacekeeping forces. NATO forces are peacekeeping forces. By fighting, by throwing ammunition on others, they will keep the peace. So in propaganda, we highlight what is what proves our point and hide what is actually the reality of it. So nobody in the of Ukrainian war is talking about the oil. Nobody is talking about the security issues of Russia. Nobody is talking about even the economy of Ukraine. Ukraine actually is the victim. See, the total number of, actually more than 80% of the total number of nuclear weapons are with Russia and America. And what threat does America have? That it is creating a group of people in the form of an army alliance. Why is it collecting so many countries with it in the form? Well, European Union is of course an economic alliance or a cultural alliance. If if some portion of Ukraine feels that it has closer ties with the Europe and there is a cultural kind of connection, then they should become members of the cultural association, not of military alliance. You know.
That's the word. Yeah.
So,
Yeah. I wish there would be more people thinking about peaceful solutions. What really saddens me is that all these other countries joining NATO, well, that's not Ukrainian people's fault, and it's the people suffering in the end.
Right. See,
I think we are getting, sir, short on time. We are getting short on time. The program is already past, I guess, 15 minutes, the stipulated time limit. I know the discussion is getting very interesting, but we got to, because our audience would slowly start leaving. So, I mean, if we could just, sum up.
This is the only thing that I want to say.
So, Noorpreet, do we have more questions?
Ma'am, I don't think so.
I'm really sorry that I had to interrupt this very interesting question answer which you were having. But yes, the time limit was there. And I particularly appreciate that there had been counter opinions also, because as we always say that the highest merit of any such academic discussion is agreeing to disagree. So it's so encouraging and it that we have so many different opinions here. Very shortly, I would like to say that the raising of Israel as a country has proved Jews as not only a very capable people in terms of business and commerce, but even in terms of military strategy also. So the success of Israel. So this is very important in countries like ours, and other countries as well in the world, particularly for communities who are not really in the center, who are more marginalized and towards the periphery. Such communities actually get hope from the rising of Jews after this kind of a gory past. So I would say, the tyrannies can be reversed, even in case of people as well as people as communities. And this is the perfect case, as we say in literature, rising from the ashes. So that was, my observation. So with this, I guess we carry on the rest of the program. Noorpreet, shall we? Yes.
So wrapping up the questions round, I now express my hearty gratitude to everyone who joined us today. And of course, our esteemed speaker for the day, Miss Simon, who opportunistically happened to address us on Women's Day. So congratulations and thank you, ma'am.
Congratulations to you, to all the women of you too, to International Women's Day. How far we've come. We've come so far that it wasn't even the subject of our talk. So thank you again for having me. Thank you for your plurality of opinions and thoughts.
All right, then I now pass on the virtual mic to Devashish for the vote of thanks.
A very good evening, everyone. I am truly delighted to be a part of this contemplative event. On behalf of Literary Club, Guru Nanak Dev University, I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to Ms. Cordula Simon for enlightening our minds. The fruits of creativity and imagine ripe because of the seeds sown by our teachers. So I would like to take a moment to thank all the members of faculty whose presence has graced the occasion. Sincere thanks to my mentors, Dr. Sumneet Kaur and Dr. Ujjaljeet, for providing us all with this beautiful opportunity. World works with the efforts of people, but it's that little more effort which leads to the glorious success. Thanks to all the members of organizing committee who were involved in putting up this great event. Acknowledgement to Nurpreet from the Department of Economics and Anmol from the Department of Human Genetics for moderating the event so smoothly. Thanks to Sanjam from Department of English for the brief introduction of our guest, and to Megha from Department of English for taking up the queries of all the attendees. I am grateful to Shaminder for handling the technicalities. He is from Department of English Literature. And a wide round of applause to all the participants. And thank you so much, all of you present here, for making the time to be with us today and embellishing the event. Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening ahead. Happy Women's Day.
So can we have a group picture?
Yes, ma'am.
So everybody please put on your cameras. Nivedita, you are clicking the pictures, right?
It's done, ma'am.
It's done. Okay, thank you so much. So that's it. Thank you so much, Cordula. It was very kind of you to spare your time to be with us. And I mean, considering the time gap as well, I was a little nervous about that, worried about that. Everything went well. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So shall we wind up?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Thank you so much, Cordula. You can now like.
Thank you. I sent you the handouts if anyone is interested in more literature. I put a little handout together. I sent it to you by WhatsApp. So you can send anyone who wants it.
Okay, right. I'll share it with all the participants here. And certainly, I mean, if they want to talk to you and say anything, they will like access you through. Shall I share your email as well?
Yeah.
Okay, fine. That would be great.
All right. Good. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you,
Thanks
ma'am.
again. Thank you so much, ma'am.